the intersection of information and conversation. Weekends with Jason Olbourne on today's News Talk, TNT.
And welcome back to Weekends. I hope you enjoyed that interview with Del Bigtree. Goodness me, he was certainly fired up. Lots to say. And you know what's really interesting is all the work that you and I have been doing over the last 4 years on social media and pointing to research. There was Del Bigtree at the absolute coalface, confirming everything that we knew and then showing us in real time what actually happens. Now, the one thing that we can conclude from that interview is that there is no one person coming to save us. There is no miracle ending. But what's really happening is those of us who are realizing what's going on are starting to see that the facts are piling up on top of each other. And the reality is that it is up to us. And the best part is that anything that you create for yourself just feels and means so much more. The value in the work that you're doing, in the work that TNT's doing, in the work that Del Bigtree's doing, and in the work of thousands of other people that we will interview here over a period of time and around the world. It just means that we create the future that we want. And so it is that we have to look forward to everything that's coming up and embracing that hard work is always worth it. And in this hour, I've got another guest who's doing an incredible amount of hard work on a different issue altogether. Let me tell you about Chris Elston. He's also known as Billboard Chris. He's a Canadian activist from Vancouver who passionately opposes gender ideology and advocates against the use of puberty blockers in children. Chris has gained notoriety for purchasing or wearing signs with messages that frequently provoke strong emotional responses from trans and gender diverse individuals. His controversial methods have sparked debates and discussions across North America and, in fact, around the world. His website is billboardchris.com. Chris, welcome to Weekends.
Thank you so much, Jason. Yes, my controversial methods have struck up a lot of controversy because I have conversations with people. Can you imagine that? Speaking to people face to face. Such a controversial method, but I felt it was important to do this, so I started heading outside wearing signs that say children cannot consent to puberty blockers, and one which is my definition of a dad, which is a human male who protects his kids from gender ideology. And most of the time I'm just having lovely, normal conversations with nice people. But yes, certainly sometimes all hell breaks loose and I get attacked and all sorts of things.
We live in this strange world where the term inclusion, if it comes out of an establishment, progressive politician's lips, it's meant to mean that nobody misses out. But when you look at the COVID experience, if you bucked the system, it was okay for you to be excluded. Here in Australia, in New South Wales, the state where I live, we were segregated for about 10 weeks at the time that the lockdowns eventually ended, when this arbitrary goal of 80% of the population was to be vaccinated, and then we're allowed to be let out. Can you believe that? Amazingly, the Premier of New South Wales at the time, Dominic Perrottet, appeared on a radio show on 2GB with Ray Hadley, and he got his head bitten off by that presenter. And then Perrottet came out and said, well, the unvaccinated will have to stay in for a further 2 weeks from December 1 to December 15, and then you'll be allowed out. This is the type of exclusion that was practiced. So the idea of inclusivity is selective, and therefore it's a load of nonsense from the very beginning. Then we talk about things like pronouns and recognizing what people are called. How is it that I'm meant to understand what somebody's pronoun is and meant to use it? How about you just tell me your name? And then we can have a conversation. This idea that somehow we have to have titles, where did that come from? Especially here in Australia, it's a very odd scenario. For a long time, Australia got rid of titles. We didn't have knighthoods, etc. We had an honour system that was simply an Order of Australia, a couple of letters after one's name. But if your name was Bob, you didn't become Sir Robert. You simply were known as Bob, and that was the case. All that's gone out the window in recent times, because in the process of becoming inclusive, all we're doing is creating separate little silos of people living in their worlds, and whatever agenda the politicians can make hay from, that's where they go. Tell me, Chris, how did you get into the idea of gender ideology and walking out there with a board? What was it that promoted this to be the issue that was the one that was literally the hill to die on?
Well, the fundamental answer to that is I'm a dad. I'm a dad of 2 girls. I'm a husband as well, of course, and I'm not going to live in a world like this and send my girls off in a world that doesn't know what a woman is, and a world that is trying to change the sex of children. we are harming perfectly healthy children. There's nothing wrong with them. They just need to be left alone to grow up. But instead, they're being taught this abusive nonsense that they were born in the wrong body. What does that even mean? It means nothing. It's total nonsense. Imagine telling your child that they were born wrong and that they need to be something they're not. That is really psychologically abusive. Never mind the physical harm that is then coming to these kids. Because when I first heard this term puberty blockers back in 2019, I said, what are those? And I looked it up, and of course, these are exactly what they sound like. These are drugs being given to kids that stop them going into puberty. We're stopping the development of children. That's totally insane. This has never been done before in the history of mankind. And then the more you read about this, the crazier it gets. And that's exactly what happened to me. I kept reading and reading and reading throughout 2019, 2020. And then the breaking point you asked about was really in the UK in July of 2020. A woman named Posey Parker, or Kelly J. Keane, she came to Australia and New Zealand, and a whole bunch of madness broke out there too. But she put up a really controversial sign. It said, "I love J.K. Rowling, the Harry Potter author." She put up that sign at the Edinburgh train station. It lasted one day because some people on Twitter complained, as they do. And so the government-run train authority took it down. And I got tired of this child abuse, and I got tired of people not being allowed to talk. Why can't we have discussions about this issue? Now we can't even say we love the world's greatest children's author. And I happen to be reading Harry Potter at bedtime every night with my little one. I said, forget this. I'm going to put up a billboard that says the same thing. So I did. I put up an actual billboard in Vancouver, a big one on the side of the road. It also lasted just 24 hours. Vancouver politicians said it was hateful, and they took it down. So then I put up a whole bunch more throughout the United States. And then about a month later, probably the beginning of October 2020, I said, well, they might be able to take down my billboard, but they can't take one off my back. So I had some signs made, and I started going outside, because it's always been my vision and my mission to create millions of conversations, to start millions of conversations on this subject, because people just need to learn about it. And when enough people learn about this, a certain percentage of them are going to become active in fighting it, and we're going to put a stop to it. And it's already happening.
It's magnificent. You've got an enormous following on X, and clearly it's working. Do you think that controversy has to be part of opening up any discussion? It doesn't seem that it's possible to be the nice guy or girl anymore and try and start a conversation. You have to literally produce a stunt like you did. And it's not necessarily a stunt. What you're trying to do is get a message out there. That message gets taken down under the guise of, hate speech or a hateful message. And so you have to keep going. Why is it so ridiculously difficult to just be able, as you said, to have a conversation today?
Yeah, it wasn't a stunt. I do love J.K. Rowling, and there's nothing wrong with saying that. People can try to perceive that as a political message or something. Well, so what? I can do that too. It doesn't have anything hateful on it, but that wasn't the case. But anyway, I think I'm pretty much as nice as they come. But on this subject, you got to be nice, but you also got to be tough, and you got to be willing to put yourself out there and take all the abuse and everything. And you have to be of the mindset that none of that matters. And it doesn't matter, because I have all the friends in the world I need. Really, all I need is right here in this house I'm sitting in right now, my wife and 2 kids. If the rest of the world hates me, I don't care. They know who I am. I know who I am. I'm a 48-year-old man. I'm not dependent on the approval of the world. So you just have to be willing to put yourself out there and tell the truth and let the chips fall where they may. And the only thing that the left can do, and I say the left because this is pushed by the far left. Sometimes people like to argue that, but it's totally being pushed by the far left, which has taken control of all the moderate left as well. They're not allowed to speak up. But we just have to tell the truth. And if people get mad or angry and all they have is intimidation and violence, well, so what? You just use that against them. If they get violent with you, if they get aggressive, just stay calm, turn that against them, show that they're crazy and violent, and then that helps to turn the normal people in the population against them, and they see that I'm standing there calmly, and without even hearing the arguments, they already know what side they want to believe in, because you got the rational person just talking about how we shouldn't sterilize kids, and they're all going crazy.
Isn't it incredible when you think that that you can create a situation. And the other thing, of course, is the exponential growth in the area. It feels like for most of my adult life, people were arguing for marriage equality, gay marriage. And that took somewhere like 20 or 30 years to come to fruition. But it took like 20 or 30 minutes for the trans agenda to just explode, and has been exploding ever since. And most people don't quite understand what it's really about. The left, the idea of live and let live, has really become a culture of permissiveness. And when I say permissiveness, I mean the idea that with the George Floyd riots, that you could literally do whatever you want. You had Joe Biden saying, oh, Antifa and Black Lives Matter are these organizations that don't really have leadership. It's just organizing it all by itself. But if you have a rally that goes in a different direction, say, for example, opposing vaccine mandates, you are the devil incarnate. And you're out there literally, trying to kill people is kind of the message that came from it. So there's this weird lopsidedness in this political ideology. What I don't understand is the trans agenda, this minority community, and we're going to dissect it in a little bit later in the show. Particularly the idea of the manipulation of the message in terms of suicides, etc., has been the common argument, and we'll talk about that. There's a lot now being written on it, a lot of studies, etc. But when you consider this bias that's going on here, you almost can't be a middle-aged white man and join a progressive party today, because you're going to be bopped on the head. What I'm trying to get to, Chris, is where did it become that the minority of all minorities has wielded so much power, and most people are just sort of watching on and thinking, I don't understand what this is really all about here?
Okay, so there's so much in there. I could spend half an hour talking nonstop on the few points you just made. So first of all, on the subject of, it seems like trans stuff came out of nowhere in 25 minutes. Well, it really didn't. And there is a connection to the LGB, only in that it was activism for all of those years, fighting for gay rights. There was a lot of resistance to that. And really all across the Western world in the first decade of this century, pretty much by 2010, gay rights had been won all across the West. So then you have all these organizations, all these nonprofits with government backing. What do? Do they close the doors and say, yay, we accomplished our goals? No, they've got to keep the donations coming in. They've got to keep everyone employed. So the new objective became trans rights. And these 4 letters, LGBT, strike fear in the hearts of men, and it stops them from speaking up about this issue, because they're instantly called a bigot and they're fired from their jobs. And so everyone felt like they couldn't speak up, which is really the only way that a movement which harms children and sterilizes them and cuts off their body parts was ever able to grow, was because it grew in silence. It grew without people speaking up. But the foundations for this movement were growing for several decades, really all the way back to the 60s, where this theory of gender identity first formed in academia back in Johns Hopkins University. And this theory of gender identity floated around academia for decades, but it really didn't emerge into the mainstream until after the gay rights movement was won, which also coincided with social media, the smartphone, and where kids stopped living their own lives and started watching other kids live theirs. And of course, children are very vulnerable. Girls especially are very vulnerable to social contagions. So this was all just really the perfect storm for this thing to suddenly grow rapidly, because it's also the first generation that's ever had smartphones and social media, and who are being exposed to all sorts of ideology and nonsense all across the world.
As you said, you could dissect that for a very long period of time. There's just so much in that, and it's interesting, isn't it, that the social media platform, the contagion, the mobile phone, etc., and the idea of watching someone else's life to influence yours is right on point there. I can recall one of my own family members going to a particular high school, and on day one, she came home. I said, "How was school?" And the response was very strange. I was, first of all, she said I was offered drugs, and the second one was one student identified as a reindeer and was on the bowl drinking on the floor, drinking out of a bowl on the floor, and said, "Dad, I don't know what's going on here." This is just in suburban Australia, and some years ago now. And I was scratching my head thinking, what are we dealing with here? Is this a form of mental disease, or is this the start of something else? And this is the point. I want to come back to that. We're going to have to take a break, but just plant the seed in there, because the one thing is that you have to start asking questions. This is not normal behavior, and it leads to where I was going before with permissiveness. But the idea here that we're not allowed to talk about so many different things, and on TNT, of course, you can. So we'll hold that thought, and we'll be back in a moment. But before we take that break, if you missed your favorite TNT show or interview, simply listen or watch it when you want, wherever you want. Just visit episodes on the TNT Radio website, rumble.com, bitchute.com, or brighteon.com. We're also on all the major podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, Spotify, Amazon, Podbean, iHeart, and TuneIn. Now, there's no reason to miss out on anything on today's News Talk TNT.
TNT's Kate Shemirani.
What a fantastic marketing ploy. How clever, how deceitful. They're aiming that £99 at the homeowners, the older people who own their own homes. I would go as far as to say it's all by design. So when they have this COVID shot and they get sick and they go into hospital, what can be slapped on them? A deprivation of liberty order, where they're not allowed to go home. Then the hospital, along with the social worker, the consultant, they decide that they can go into a care home. 95% of the care homes in the UK are owned by who? HC1 and Barchester, who have their accounts in the Cayman Islands, where all of those 90,000 patients during the first lockdown went, and most of them died.
Kate Shemirani on today's News Talk TNT. A better business tip from TNT Radio. News Talk Radio listeners are some of the most active and involved listeners of any format. TNT Radio listeners rely on TNT Radio often as their primary source of information. They trust TNT Radio and are highly engaged with the content. If you'd like more information about advertising on TNT Radio, simply fill out your details on our contact page and we'll be in touch. To find out more, go to tntradio.live.
You are about to hear
Today's News Talk and the voice of freedom.
That's what this country's all about.
TNT Radio.
And welcome back to Weekends. My guest this hour, Chris Elston, or Billboard Chris. Now, before the break, Chris, I mentioned the idea that we're dealing with a situation that in any other time in history, we would have identified a particular person as being perhaps having mental health or mental issues when you're on the floor in a school classroom pretending or believing that you're a reindeer drinking milk out of a bowl. What's going on here?
That's an extreme situation, but really what's going on, and to keep it focused on this one subject of gender, what used to be called gender identity disorder was changed in 2013 in the DSM-5, the Bible for psychiatrists, essentially is what it is, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual. They changed the term to gender dysphoria because to call it a disorder was hurting people's feelings. And we see this sort of movement going on all over the place. You can't judge anything. You can't call anything a mental illness because that's going to be harmful. This whole movement of DEI sounds wonderful, diversity, equity, and inclusion. You were talking about inclusivity before, but really those are just euphemisms for what some people call cultural Marxism, neo-Marxism, neo-communism. This is essentially the teaching that society is systemically oppressive, that all facets of our Western culture are oppressive. You're either oppressed based on your race, your sexuality, your sex, your financial status. They believe that capitalism itself is evil. And so you have this oppressor-victim mentality going on, and it's the victims who get celebrated today. So now you got this girl in school who's clearly having a mental breakdown, but we don't dare call it that. Because yes, we need to be gentle to this person. We need to be supportive of this person. But they've turned mental health issues into a civil rights movement. They've turned gender identity disorder into a civil rights movement where you can't question it. You can't call it a mental health problem. You have to now acknowledge that this person has a magical gender identity. It's as though they have a gendered soul where they are female on the inside, even though they're a male. Well, what does that mean to have a gender identity? Nobody can tell you. I have asked this question 10,000 times. No exaggeration. Nobody can define it. If you look at the most used resource in the world, it's this cute little picture of a gingerbread man that they call the genderbread person. This is a resource used in schools and even at children's hospitals to teach the nurses. And it says your gender identity is based on your personality, your job, your hobbies, likes, dislikes, roles in society, and expectations upon you. This is all sexist, regressive nonsense. What does your job have to do with your gender? Are we going back to the 50s and 60s where women have to work in the kitchens and only men can be astronauts? This is nonsense. If a woman is an astronaut, does that put her on the male end of the spectrum? If a girl wants to climb trees and chase lizards or kangaroos or giant Australian spiders and she's a tomboy, does that make her an actual boy? Of course not. She's a beautiful girl. Gender identity is just personality. That's all it is. I have this expression, there are two sexes, zero genders, and infinite personalities, because that just sums us all up. But this ideology on the tail of the gay rights movement has just bamboozled everyone, and all the government and all these nonprofits and all these different agencies and the WHO and the UN, they're all pushing this as reality, and it's all one big lie, and we don't have to play along with it.
And I'm certainly glad that, Chris, the work that you're able to do to represent it and so beautifully summarize the situation. Would you mind just repeating for our audience the way that you described it was two sexes?
Two sexes, zero genders, and infinite personalities.
Yeah, yeah. And
everyone is male or female. Now, these activists, they like to pretend that there are people who are in between sexes. They call them intersex. These are people who have disorders of their sexual development. It's got nothing to do with this conversation, and they're all male or female too. There's a condition called Klinefelter syndrome, where there are people with this situation where during their embryonic development, things didn't form properly. And there's the very rare case of a male, for example, who might have a uterus inside. It's called intramullary duct syndrome. But it doesn't mean anything. It's a useless uterus. They're still fully male. They produce sperm. Ultimately, it's the gametes that we produce, sperm or eggs, that determine our sex. And don't let them sidetrack you into these conversations, because the trans activists will try to do it every time. The situation we're talking about is kids who are just having a hard time in life, who are being told this nonsense that they were born in the wrong body, and they're only going to find true happiness by transitioning. They're only going to find true happiness by going on puberty blockers, the opposite sex's hormones, by girls getting their breasts cut off, sending teenage girls into menopause, by boys getting castrated and having their penis inverted to form a neo-vagina. This is supposed to make them better? This is total nonsense. Where's the evidence for it? Oh, shocker, there is none. But trans activists lie like a rug and scream bloody murder if you dare to challenge it. And that screaming worked for a while, but we have to ignore it and just tell the truth.
Yeah, well said. Now, Chris, you got, targeted by the Australian government for a post you shared on X. Can you tell us what happened?
So, Vice President of the Australian Professional Association of Transgender Health is a woman named Teddy Cook. Teddy Cook says she's a man. She has cut off her breasts. She is very fond of bondage, of having trans-identified drug-fueled orgies. She has promoted bestiality. And the Daily Mail wrote this article about her because she was appointed to a panel of 20 World Health Organization experts to write the policy, the healthcare policy for trans-identified individuals. This is someone who is clearly struggling with her own issues. And I wish all these people the most prosperous, successful life possible. But that is not someone who should be writing healthcare policy for other people who are struggling. If you're into bestiality, you shouldn't be writing healthcare policy. That's not controversial. So I wrote this post. I called her a woman because she is. That's not hate. That's the truth. And we need to stop playing along with this cult by using the alternate pronouns for people. Because what are you doing when you call a woman a he? You've got one foot inside the door of this cult. You're lending legitimacy to it. You're saying, yeah, that's fine. And what message are you sending to society and to kids? You're taking part in this belief system that says children are born wrong. and that we need to change their bodies. And that's abuse. This whole thing is abusive. So do whatever you want to your body if you're an adult. Doctors shouldn't just do whatever an adult wants to their body. They have a higher purpose. They swore an oath to first do no harm. They're not just order takers like someone sitting in a drive-through where you come through and order a cheeseburger. If someone comes in and says, I want a double mastectomy, I don't care if you're 15, 16, 18, 19, or 20, a doctor shouldn't just be doing that the second they ask for one, because they're not order takers. They should be looking into trauma. They should be looking into other mental health comorbidities. They should be looking into abuse and sexual abuse. The majority of these kids who want to transition have suffered sexual abuse. If a girl has been getting sexually abused, guess what? She's not loving being a girl, obviously. And now, instead of just wearing hoodies and baggy pants, baggy sweatshirts to hide her body, well, now she's being given the option that she can just transition to a boy. And for a lot of the girls, they think that's going to solve their problems. And of course it doesn't. But this is like trying to kill your old self that was miserable for whatever reason and being born again. Well, it doesn't work like that. You're the same exact person with the same exact struggles, except now you've been sterilized, lost body parts, and you've been turned into a lifelong pharmaceutical patient.
And of course, there's no part of that improves anyone's day-to-day feeling at all. The opposite, to be infertile, to be lost in another situation. It's really just running away from a problem, isn't it? Now, in this particular post that you share, it sends incredible controversy because the Australian government orders X to remove it. But the boss or the buyer of X, Elon Musk, he decided to get involved. What went on there?
Yeah, that's right. And I forgot to say what I said in that post, and I'll admit it's a little more acerbic than my normal tweet. I said people who belong in psychiatric wards should not be writing healthcare policy for people who belong in psychiatric wards. Okay, so it might be a little strong. I'll stand by it. And I'm on the other side of the world, and the e-safety commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, a former Twitter employee and director of public policy for Twitter in Australia, decided that she gets to be the arbiter of what is acceptable or not and ordered my post taken down. So what's she going to do? Control the internet for all 8 billion people on the planet and determine every post that's acceptable or not? It wasn't an incitement to violence or anything like that. I could understand that. This is just my opinion and I'm entitled to it. But yes, they ordered Twitter to take it down. They ordered X to take it down. So X geo-blocked it. People in Australia can't see that post right now. It is still up. But I was going to appeal this. I spoke with the Free Speech Union in Australia and I'm working with those guys. So I haven't filed it yet, but I will be shortly. And then the day after I decided to do that, I saw on X that they're also appealing this ruling because Elon is standing up for free speech. So now, what was a post that didn't even have 400,000 views, my first one, now this is a global news story. Elon's involved. That tweet between all the different people tweeting it out has probably been seen 20 million times. And this story isn't going away anytime soon because there's lawfare coming up. And we're just going to keep bringing this story up again and again and again. And I hope Julie Inman-Grant gets the message that she shouldn't try to censor our speech. But I hope one thing even more. I hope she keeps trying because it's just going to keep backfiring every time. And this helps to reach a whole lot of people with the truth about this child abuse. So you just take whatever comes your way. If they'd leave me alone, I'd only reach a few people. Now that they try to censor me, it's the Streisand effect and it reaches a lot more.
Isn't it incredible that in that process, what you've learnt now is the art of manipulating the media to shift the narrative? In many ways, people who observe realize that that's how Donald Trump's run his entire political career, by saying the exact right or wrong thing at the exact right or wrong time to be able to do it. So this incredible new benefit appears. Now, you made the point there of the e-safety commissioner, Julie Inman-Grant, being the arbiter of truth, inverted commas, on the social media platform that goes around the world. And at the very least, at least it was only geo-blocked in Australia, that they weren't going to get that post taken down for the rest of the world. But here we have bureaucrats literally playing censor or playing God. And at the same time, as you mentioned earlier with these operations, doctors playing God. And that's where I wanted to go with this next question. Where did we ever get a situation, or is this something that was always inbuilt in the system, that doctors somehow, if you accept first do no harm, the Hippocratic Oath should be the starting point, at what point did doctors walk past that and then say, no, we're going to literally play God here and determine the gender of a human being.
So most doctors don't go along with this, but in each city in the Western world, it only takes a few doctors to harm 1,000 kids because they'll each see a few of them each day. And so this is the situation you have where you have cult doctors working at these children's hospitals with the backing of their medical bodies, with the backing of the UN and the WHO and all the leftist governments in the world who are virtue signaling, saying that they just want to help these poor children to be who they really are and that they'll kill themselves if we don't transition them. Another despicable lie. But honestly, it's just a fraction of these doctors, and that's all you need to cause countless harm to kids all over the world. And what happens if we don't put a stop to this is you get this cycle that starts to generate. This is now in schools. This didn't used to be in schools. They didn't used to teach gender identity when you and I went to school, but now they're teaching this ideology in schools. This is an ideology. This is not science. This is a belief system. This, for all practical purposes, is a cult, a quasi-religion, in a belief in a gendered soul. But the children who are struggling, the ones who are the misfits, and the kids with autism especially, a majority of these kids at the gender clinics have autism. According to the Tavistock, the biggest gender clinic in the world in England that just got shut down, 35% of the kids had moderate to severe autism out of a sample of more than 1,000. Never mind the minor cases, the more mild ones. But these are just the kids who are struggling. These aren't the college quarterbacks and the cheerleaders. These are the struggling misfit kids who are now being indoctrinated in schools and online to believe that they don't fit in because they were born wrong and they need to be something they're not. So that is then followed up by a vicious lie that kids are going to kill themselves if we don't transition them. You get these parents going into the gender clinics where they're told you can have a live son, a live trans son, or they'll just say a live son, or a dead daughter. And these parents who have this struggling child, well, of course, no one wants children to die, of course. So this is the only way you could ever justify the brutal things they're doing to children. Sterilizing autistic kids, sterilizing kids who would grow up to be gay. All the studies historically before we gave kids puberty blockers, and this is very important, they're all up on my website. But really since around 2003, 4, 5, they were giving kids puberty blockers all the time. So that's when the last study ended. But the last study followed 139 boys for 15, 20 years, from when they were really little all the way into their 20s. 87.8% of them saw their distress with their sex just go away. They grew out of it. 63.6% grew up to be gay. And all those studies back then, from the 80s and 90s and 70s, they all show similar statistics. And this was when gender identity disorder affected 1 out of tens of thousands. So the same sort of thing is happening today. It's kids who would grow up to be gay, who defy stereotypes, who don't fit in. Well, now they're being told they're trans. No, there's no such thing as a transgender child. They're called girls and boys. And the positive message we should be sending is that they're beautiful just as they are. No drugs or scalpels needed. The positive message we should be sending is that there's no right way to be a boy or a girl. That's the opposite of what these trans activists do. They're pushing stereotypes to such a degree, they're saying children need to change their body. But they don't get it. They have this blind spot because they're in a cult and they don't see it. And they self-police their own thoughts and they don't allow themselves to look at the actual evidence. And that evidence is, according to Finland, just in the last month on the subject of suicides, they looked at 23 years worth of data from 1996 to 2019. 2,083 kids came into the gender clinic in Finland. These children were not lost to follow-up like they would be in the US, where a kid leaves a clinic in Chicago and they never know what happens to them again. Unless the child left the country, none of these kids were lost to follow-up. And the actual suicide rate in any given year for these children going to these gender clinics was 0.051%. 1 out of 2,000. Over the 23 years of this study, there were only 7 suicides. Yet to listen to these activists today, you think that they're all killing themselves. And it's all a lie. And it's a terrible lie. And we just need to get the truth out there because it's just so coercive. It's just gross. And like you mentioned earlier, the left does this with everything. They did this with COVID. All they do is use fear to get their way. There's an eclipse coming up in a couple of days. We've even got school districts in Canada shutting down school for the day because kids might look at the sun. It's crazy. And it's the teachers' unions pushing that, of course. It's the radical leftists pushing this. I guess they just don't want to work. But they're creating this just whole climate of fear about everything. And they lie to get their way. And we just got to be strong and tell the truth.
It's certainly a blight on the education system that says that we have to keep our kids at home because of a solar eclipse in case they might burn their eyes out by taking a glimpse at it for the split second that it occurs, that the teachers are unable to actually educate a child to not do something that might harm them. It's an incredible story. Now, Chris, I do want to talk a bit more about this suicide issue. We're going to take a break in a moment. I also want to talk to you more about the strange phenomenon of this high percentage of autistic children presenting at Tavistock, which thankfully has been closed down. These are very, very serious issues. And obviously, when you scrape from the surface, you realise that there's something quite sinister going on underneath. We'll take that break now and we'll come back with more. You're watching and listening to Weekends with Jason Olbourne here on TNT.
From weather and traffic reports
to news of political developments,
we turn to journalists for the information we need to live our daily lives.
Journalists around the world provide news that is essential for democracy,
for personal freedom, and for safety and stability.
Yet their ability to report freely and safely is under attack like never before.
Too many journalists are paying with their lives. They face exponential risks and they've already paid a heavy toll.
Death threats, online harassment, and physical attacks
are becoming a daily experience of journalists in all countries.
We just want people to be safe, to be able to get our readers the information that they need to make informed decisions.
They checked my phone and realized that it was Pegasus. I feel myself like I'm naked in the street.
These charges were politicized from the start.
Facts win. Truth wins. Justice wins.
C'est énorme pour moi d'être là, d'être libre, surtout que je ne m'y attendais pas du tout.
Stand with a free press.
Stand with journalists whose reporting won't be silenced. Press freedom is your freedom.
Right, I've got cancer. I've been trying to tell the rest of you, but no one's listening. And I don't just mean you, ears, eyes. Would you look in the damn toilet for once? Hands, roll those sleeves and take a sample. And legs, trot off to the doctor to get me looked at. Because bowel cancer can be successfully treated when detected early. Now look who's finally woken up.
Weekends are better when you spend it with us. Weekends with Jason Olbourne on today's News Talk, TNT.
Welcome back to Weekends. My guest this hour, Chris Elston, Billboard. Chris. Now, Chris, I just want to read from it's a news article, and it's talking about the argument that allows people in this transgender movement to almost guilt the parents into going along with their plans. And it refers to the evidence or the reference that they quote. And it says that the flyer's sole reference for its 93% claim is an obscure survey by a Canadian lobby group called Transpulse that was never published in a medical journal, not peer-reviewed, but simply posted at the group's website. A small unrepresentative sample of 84 anonymous youth a decade ago with no control group, no in-person interviews, no follow-up to clarify the claims of attempted suicide. So should such an incendiary 93% claim based on borderline junk science still be portrayed to parents as medical truth? Why would a children's hospital still frighten parents with the statistics on suicide when high-quality evidence finds their child's gender dysphoria does not increase the risk of suicide or medical transition, does not reduce it either? It's an incredible comparison, isn't it, to what we just talked about?
That's not borderline junk science. That's just pure junk. So that's some online survey by self-selected participants from a decade ago, which means absolutely nothing. We have a lot of data on this. I would encourage people to go to a website called statsforgender.org. You can enter suicide in the search bar there, and all sorts of stuff will come up, the truth on this. But as I just said from Finland, that's the only clinical study into kids that's ever been done. It's not a small study. More than 2,000 kids at the gender clinic, more than 17,000 in a control group. And the only common denominator for the suicides, and they were a very small number, but the common denominator was kids who were struggling with mental health issues. It wasn't gender. It was kids in the control group as well who were struggling with mental health issues. The numbers are similar. It's just a total lie. And then we've got all sorts of data with the adult population. We've got a study out of Sweden that showed 10 years after sex reassignment surgery with the adult population, suicides were 19.1 times higher than their peers after accounting for other peers with similar mental health problems. If you compared them to the general population, it was 40 times higher. And then just out of California, this study is actually a year and a half old or so, but I only became aware of it a month ago. They looked at 868 men, and they looked at 2 years before surgery and 2 years after their surgery. The suicide rate before was 1.5%. The suicide rate after was 3.3%, the suicide attempt rate. So more than double after the so-called gender-affirming care. It's just all a lie. There's no truth to it whatsoever. And forget about studies for a second, because people talk about studies all the time.
Yep.
You don't need a study to know that we shouldn't be trying to change the sex of children. You don't need a study to know that we shouldn't be stopping puberty with a chemical castration drug used on pedophiles by giving that to children. This is a prostate cancer drug. It's for endometriosis in women. It's never been approved by any health authority on planet Earth for the purpose of treating gender dysphoria. It's used off-label. And then we're giving them the opposite sex's hormones. After 4 or 5 years on testosterone, these girls have to get hysterectomies. Sometimes they're cutting out their ovaries as well. It's called an oophorectomy. We're sending teenage girls into menopause. They'll never be able to have families, these kids. The boys, when they start on puberty blockers at what's called Tanner stage 2, this is the beginning of puberty. I've got the president of the World Professional Association for Transgender Health on video. This is a man who says he's a woman. His name's Marcy Bowers. And he admits on a video that literally none of the boys who started on puberty blockers at the beginning of puberty have been able to have an orgasm as an adult. So we're turning kids into lifelong pharmaceutical patients, sterilized, anorgasmic, missing body parts. You don't need a study to know that's wrong. Leave our kids alone. They're beautiful just as they are.
Yeah, well said, Chris. I want to go back to the statistics before with the numbers that you gave on autism, was representing something like 3.5 out of 10 kids presenting at Tavistock had autism. Where I'm going with this is I want to try and draw some conclusions here as to why it is that these particular types of kids are the ones that are presenting. Perhaps it might be that a teenager and the hormones kicking in and realizing that the social interaction or the ability to obviously to meet the opposite sex or the same sex, as it were, and for the sexual relations to begin, and it's just not happening as perhaps one of the reasons, because of this social situation, this social reasoning that they can't seem to have this particular contact. Maybe that's the reason why. I don't know. I'm asking you the question, but that just seemed the first thing that came to mind, because it's such an overwhelming number and of course an easy target. It seems to be that the system is literally preying on the weak here.
Yeah, that 35% number was moderate to severe. There's a lot of more mild cases, and there's kids with Asperger's syndrome as well. So that is, I would say, a majority of the kids are on the spectrum somewhere for sure, and also a majority have been sexually abused. So you end up with a lot of autistic kids who've been sexually abused. You end up with Indigenous kids going to these gender clinics. Here in Canada, we have, in British Columbia, where I'm from, one psychologist is transitioning over 1,000 kids, including more than 500 in state care. That's 8% of all the kids in state care. being transitioned by one psychologist who works for the BC government, for the BC Ministry of Children and Families. Well, 52% of kids in state care are Indigenous across Canada. So it's just these vulnerable kids. And I'm not an autism expert, so I'm not going to claim to be, but I've talked to a lot of parents. And they tell me that once some of these kids get an idea in their head, it can be really hard to get that idea back out. So they're being ideologically groomed online or in school. They're being indoctrinated to believe that the reason for their discomfort, the reason they don't fit in, the reason they're having social issues is because they were born in the wrong body. And you really have to look at this like a cult. And in cults, they're all about recruiting. They've got to grow. And so these schools today have these gender and sexuality alliances. These are lunchtime and after school clubs where these struggling kids go to. And they get some pink-haired 23-year-old teacher who's all about getting kids to be trans and just loves it. She thinks she's saving their lives. And they teach this nonsense to these kids. And it's being presented as the solution for why they don't fit in. And these kids already don't fit in. And then they hang on to this idea tightly. And then this is being hidden from their parents as well. I don't know what the policies are in Australian schools, but all across North America, in the United Kingdom, it's been the policy of schools to hide from parents when their own child has a new name and new pronouns. They are doing a psychological intervention on these children and hiding it from the parents, and they're wholly unqualified to do so. And the pronoun thing is important. I think a lot of people don't really think about it enough. So I'm going to drive this home for a second. And I know I'm ranting, but it's important. What message are you sending a girl when you call her a boy, when you call her he, him? You're not kind. You're telling her that she's supposed to be something she's not. That's the opposite of kindness. You're reinforcing the most negative message possible. And then in the school, all the other kids are reinforcing it. And all the teachers and administrators are reinforcing it. Thousands of times over the course of the school year, this vulnerable child, often with autism, often who has been abused or sexually abused, or have whatever trauma going on in their life, family problems, who knows what. Well, it's being reinforced over and over and over again that they're supposed to be something they're not. What chance does that kid have of pulling out of that and going against that whole wave of affirmation, all this special attention? You're so special now. We didn't know you existed before, but now you're special because you have a special identity and we're celebrating you. They're not going to pull out of that. They're going to keep going to the next step, the puberty blockers, the hormones. And then they get into their 20s. And what happens? Well, their brain finally stops developing. The prefrontal cortex develops until you're about 25. And just in the last month, we had these files that were leaked, the WPATH files, the World Professional Association for Transgender Health. Their own video conferences where clinicians are talking to each other, doctors are talking to each other, and a lot of their own internal messages were leaked. And where I'm from, for example, you've got this endocrinologist at the BC Children's Hospital saying that he follows these kids into their 20s. And, you know, they get to be 25 years old and they want to have a family, but they're sterilized. And he says so callously, yeah, the dog's not doing it for you, is it? As though having a pet could be a replacement for having a family and children. And so now all the love bombing from their teenage years are over. Now they're alone in their mid-20s. They're a lifelong pharmaceutical patient, forever buying estrogen or testosterone. And they've got health problems racking up. And now this is when the suicides really do start to increase, according to all the studies we have, like that one out of Sweden. It's not the year after, it's more like 10 years after. So the whole thing is just a total tragedy. We need to take it out from its roots, which is the ideology itself. So every parent needs to make sure this isn't in their schools. And if it is, they need to make a huge fuss. That's my nice word for it.
Well said, Chris. Do you think there's going to be a time when this does reverse, that there is that, you know, the line in the sand that people go, okay, that's enough, that something will change? Or is this a trend that's going to take years and years and years before it just evolves into something else?
So I don't think it. I know it. I know we're going to put a stop to this because it's too crazy to last, just as lobotomies were put a stop to. we all look back at the 50s and 60s and we say, oh my gosh, those ancient, silly humans, they were so dumb. They took ice picks and put them through orbital sockets and jabbed away at the prefrontal cortex of people's brains thinking that was going to make them better.
Oh.
Wow. Aren't they dumb? Look at what we're doing today. Cutting out the womb of teenage girls, saying that's going to make them better. So we just need to get the truth out there because people don't know this is happening. And we need to get back to the positive message. You can't just fight things all the time. It's much better to have positive messages to replace this message with. And the positive message is, as I always say, children are beautiful just as they are. No drugs or scalpels needed. There's no right way to be a boy or a girl. We all knew this until like 5 minutes ago.
Yeah.
We still know it. But the younger generation is being lied to and they're being confused. They know instinctively it's wrong too. So we are going to put a stop to this, especially medically. We're putting a stop to it already. And 2 years ago, no one believed me this would happen this quick. I always knew it would because we just had to get enough conversations started. We had to make enough people aware. But now Sweden, England, Finland, Norway, Denmark, Germany, 23 or 24 different states in the US have put a stop to this. In Alberta in Canada, one of the provinces, they're putting a stop to it. And all the scientific literature is out there. Now, some countries like the Canadian government and all the Democrats in the US and all of the Australian Labor government, they're going to pretend this data doesn't exist. They're just going to put their fingers in their ears and pretend that the truth isn't out there. So we just need to keep screaming from the rooftops and we need to vote these people out because they're a danger to our kids.
Absolutely. Well, the good news is in Canada is this year is an election year and the Justin Trudeau government that has
next year.
Sorry, got that wrong. But you've got Pierre Poilievre, the Conservative leader, seemingly jumping ahead of Trudeau. Trudeau's popularity is down like 25%. Do you feel confident that there will be a change in government then?
Yeah, so I say next year. We don't know when the next election will be because Trudeau can call it anytime he wants, but he has until about October of 2025 to have an election. And if an election were held today, he'd get destroyed. He has no chance. If an election were held today, it's an absolute conservative majority. Now, I say conservative, I should say conservative with air quotes, because they're pretty much conservative in name only. They all voted unanimously to call it conversion therapy to help a child feel comfortable with their bodies. It's now a crime in Canada. If your girl thinks she's a boy, it's a crime to object to that and to help her feel comfortable as a girl. They call that conversion therapy. Now, good luck prosecuting anyone. But what this has done is it's put a whole chill across the whole counseling profession. They're all afraid to talk to these kids because they'll be charged with the crime. But the Conservatives are, of course, way better than Trudeau. Almost anyone is way better than Trudeau. He's a total disaster. And Pierre Poilievre, reluctantly, it had to be dragged out of him, but he finally admitted just about a month ago that he thinks children shouldn't get puberty blockers. He hasn't talked about it since then, and he never wants to talk about this subject, but we're getting there. So I'm 100% confident he's going to win. And it's up to each province because each province does their own healthcare. So in BC, for example, we have essentially a communist government right now. They might as well call themselves the trans party. They will never stop this until we vote them out. But they can't ignore the truth either forever. We just have to keep making the broad populace aware of this because the truth is out there and the truth spreads for free no matter how much they try to suppress it.
It's remarkable that Canada seems to be the basket case that Australia also thinks it is. We seem to be competing with each other who can be the more crazy on a daily basis. And it's incredible, isn't it, that you can have a Conservative leader that you seem to have to draw out the bleeding obvious. It's no different here as we here fight the digital ID bill that got shoved through the Senate a little over a week ago. Without even a debate being allowed. It was ignored from the House of Reps. So it went upside down in terms of the passing. This from our government that we were told was meant to be the most transparent in history. And they've now passed, I think, some 80 or 90 bills without debate. One wonders what the point of politicians are. But really says to us that we're facing this odd situation that these particular governments are very happy to hand over sovereignty to the WHO, look towards a global government scenario. We seem to be just ripping our hair out as we watch what's going on. But Chris, I want to thank you. We have reached the end of our time, but for the magnificent work that you've done, technically a career change, but the idea that when you find the cause that changes your life and it just so happens to land in your lap, you take the bull by its horns and off you go, and educating people around the world like not many are able to do on this particular subject. You speak beautifully, you present beautifully, and you are a leader to all parents out there who are also confused. And I encourage people to go to your website at billboardchris.com to get the latest information and to follow you also on X. Just quickly, can you give us the X handle so people can find you there?
Yeah, that's really where I do everything. My website's basic, but X is at Billboard Chris, Instagram as well. And if people want to support me, because I'm still traveling the world and I'll try to get down to Australia, there's a donate button on my website, billboardchris.com. So thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Well, up next, we've got Senator Ralph Babette. This is Weekends with Jason Olbourne here on TNT.